This firefighter was about to die. While rescuing a baby trapped in a burning house in Palisades, the flames closed in and the smoke took over. He collapsed while clutching the baby. He was sure it was the end for both of them. But then, something unexpected happened. He met Jesus, right there in the middle of the flames. Was it just his imagination, or did something supernatural actually happen? And why did Jesus show up in that moment? To understand how he got to that moment, we need to start at the beginning. His name is Jake Rivera, a firefighter in the Los Angeles Fire Department. Jake is not just any firefighter, he is a man who believes in the power of his work to change lives. From a young age, Jake had dreamed of becoming a firefighter. Growing up in East Los Angeles, he had seen the devastating impact of fires in his own community, including the one that claimed his family's apartment when he was just 10 years old. That fire was a defining moment for Jake. He remembered the bravery of the firefighters who had saved his younger sister. And from then on, he was determined to be like them, a protector. 8 years ago, he joined the LAFD with that goal in mind. Over time, he earned the respect of his team for his relentless dedication and unshakable focus. But the road had not been easy. The fire department, like many other public institutions, was constantly battling budget constraints. 2 years ago, those challenges escalated when the city announced significant budget cuts. Under the leadership of Mayor Karen Bass, Los Angeles was struggling with a financial crisis. Wildfire seasons had been growing longer and more destructive, draining state and local resources. Combined with other economic pressures, the city had no choice but to make painful reductions across departments. The LAFD wasn't spared. Jake remembered hearing the news that layoffs were imminent, and for weeks he feared he would be among those let go. The department leaders made it clear they had to prioritize seniority and specialized skills when deciding who would stay. Jake was lucky. His reputation for keeping calm under pressure saved his job. However, not everyone was so fortunate. Several of his closest friends, including those he had trained with, were let go. Jake watched as they packed up their lockers, their heads down with disappointment. The loss of those firefighters left the department severely understaffed, and the remaining crew was forced to pick up the slack. The workload became grueling. Overtime, hours were mandatory, and days blurred into nights as the team scrambled to meet the city's needs. For Jake, the stress was constant. He worried about the strain on his team and prayed daily that nothing catastrophic would happen. With fewer firefighters available, they were vulnerable, and Jake knew it. Then came the wildfire season that everyone dreaded. California's fire season has become a year-round threat. But this time, the conditions are worse than ever. A record-breaking heat wave has baked the state, drying out vegetation and turning the landscape into a powder keg. When the first reports of a brush fire in the foothills came through on January 7th, Jake and his team were dispatched immediately. At first, the fire seemed manageable, but the dry winds had other plans. The flames are spreading rapidly, consuming acres of land. So, by the next morning, entire neighborhoods were under threat. Jake's team was sent to the front lines. It was chaos. Residents fled with whatever belongings they could carry, leaving behind homes that would soon be reduced to ash. Jake and his crew worked tirelessly, trying to create fire breaks and extinguish hotspots. They fought to save each house as if it were their own, but the fire was relentless. Jake could feel the pressure mounting as water resources began to end. Hydrants ran dry and backup resources were delayed due to the sheer scale of the disaster. Even now, the teams are moving from one neighborhood to the next, doing everything they can to protect what remains. In one area, they managed to clear a path for a family whose car had been blocked by fallen debris. In another, they helped evacuate an elderly woman who refused to leave her home until she was sure her dog was safe. Every rescue felt like a small victory, but for every house they saved, another was consumed by flames. Jake cannot shake the images of the destruction. Charred ruins where homes once stood, families crying as they watch their lives go up in smoke. The news stations are calling it one of the worst fires in California's history. Jake does not need reporters to tell him that. He is living it. The fire is behaving like a living, breathing monster, jumping highways, crossing rivers, and creating its own weather patterns. Exhaustion is weighing heavily on the team, but they are pressing on, knowing that lives depend on their efforts. Days are turning into nights, and the battle against the fire continues. Jake says his body aches from the physical toll, and his lungs burn from the smoke. Still, he is pushing forward, driven by a sense of duty that won't allow him to stop. But recently, there came the night that changed everything. Jake's crew was dispatched to a neighborhood that had been particularly hard hit. When they arrived, the scene was apocalyptic. Flames roared on both sides of the street, consuming houses one by one. The heat was suffocating, even through their protective gear, and the air was thick with smoke and ash. Jake took in the destruction and felt a deep sense of dread. The fire seemed to have no end. As they moved down the street, the urgency intensified. They knew people were still trapped in their homes, unable to escape the fast-moving flames. Jake and his team worked methodically, breaking down doors and searching for survivors. The smoke made it nearly impossible to see, and every breath felt like inhaling fire. They evacuated whoever they could find. An elderly couple, a young mother with her baby, a man who had stayed behind to try to save his house. Each rescue brought a brief moment of relief, but the devastation around them was overwhelming. Then Jake entered a street that seemed like something out of a nightmare. Every house was burning, and the flames had turned the asphalt into a furnace. The sky was a deep, angry orange, and the heat was so intense that it felt like it could melt their gear. Jake knew this was not just another street. This was a tipping point. He had no idea that his life was about to change forever. It was a scene Jake Rivera had witnessed too many times over the past few weeks. A street engulfed in flames, houses reduced to smoldering ruins, and people in a frenzy trying to salvage their lives. But this time, it felt different. The fire was alive, roaring and devouring everything in its path. Every breath Jake took was thick with smoke and ash, but he pushed forward. Lives depended on it. As Jake scanned the chaos, his eyes locked onto a frantic woman standing in front of a burning house. Her face was streaked with soot and tears as she screamed and pointed toward the house. Jake's heart sank as he realized what she was saying. Her baby was still inside. Without a moment's hesitation, Jake sprang into action. He didn't think. He didn't have time to think. The mother's cries echoed in his ears as he sprinted toward the house, his gear feeling heavier with each step. The heat was unbearable, and the fire crackled and popped. He paused at the door, taking one last deep breath before plunging into the inferno. Inside, the heat was suffocating. Flames danced along the walls, consuming everything in their reach. Smoke filled the air, making it nearly impossible to see or breathe. Jake moved quickly, but carefully, his eyes scanning for any sign of the baby. His training kicked in, guiding his every step. But deep down, fear gnawed at the edges of his mind. Time was running out. Then, he heard it. A faint, muffled cry. It was coming from upstairs. Jake's heart raced as he made his way toward the sound. The stairs groaned under his weight, threatening to give way at any moment. He reached the second floor and spotted the nursery door, its edges glowing orange from the heat. With a surge of adrenaline, he kicked the door open. Inside, the flames had not yet reached the crib, but the air was thick with smoke. The baby, a little girl, was wailing, her tiny fists flailing in the air. Jake didn't hesitate. He grabbed her, cradling her close to his chest, and turned to leave. But as he stepped back into the hallway, the fire roared to life and blocked his path. Panic surged through him as he realized he was trapped. The smoke grew thicker, clawing at his lungs and blurring his vision. His breaths came in shallow, ragged gasps, each one more painful than the last. Jake felt his strength ending. He clung to the baby, his arms trembling as he tried to shield her from the heat. The world around him began to spin, the fire's roar fading into a distant hum. Then, everything went black. Jake wasn't sure how much time had passed, but when he opened his eyes, he was no longer in the burning house. In fact, he was not anywhere he recognized. He felt weightless, as if he were floating. Below him, he saw the city. Los Angeles, his home. But it was not the bustling metropolis he knew. It was a landscape of fire and destruction. The streets were rivers of flame, buildings crumbled into ash, and smoke rose in thick plumes that darkened the sky. Jake was floating into the sky, or it was just his spirit. Jake felt himself rising, moving higher and higher above the chaos. The city grew smaller beneath him. Back at the hospital, Jake was treated for smoke inhalation and minor burns. The doctors told him he was lucky to be alive. His oxygen levels had been dangerously low when they found him, and if Andy had not acted so quickly, the outcome could have been very different. Jake nodded, thanking them, but his mind was elsewhere. He could not stop thinking about the light, the presence, and the voice that had spoken to him. Even after he was discharged, the experience stayed with him. It was not something he could easily explain, even to himself. Was it a hallucination brought on by the smoke and stress, or had he truly experienced something beyond this world? Jake Rivera could not stop replaying the moment in his mind. Every time he closed his eyes, he was back there, floating above the city, the destruction, the chaos. He could feel the heat of the flames, but also the serenity of the stars. And then there was the light. He had been pulled toward it, drawn in by its warmth and peace, and he had heard a voice that was unmistakable. It was Jesus. What Jesus had shared with Jake in those moments was not just a personal revelation. It felt universal, like it was meant not just for him, but for everyone. The clarity and urgency of the message stayed with him, even after he was pulled back to earth. The words were not a simple command or a miracle cure for the fires ravaging California. Instead, they were a deeper truth, a call to action that Jake could not ignore. So, what did Jesus tell him? Jake says that Jesus told him, the fires are just a physical manifestation of drought, heat, and negligence. They are symbolic of something much greater. The flames consuming the land mirror the division and hopelessness consuming the hearts of people. Jake remembered Jesus' voice explaining not with condemnation but with sorrow, that the only way to stop the fires, both literal and figurative, is through a change in the hearts of humanity. Help each other. That was the first part of the message, and it struck Jake deeply. In the chaos of the world, people have grown disconnected, more focused on their own survival than on lifting each other up. Jesus emphasized that real change requires community. Jake can still feel the weight of those words. He has seen it in his own life, how firefighters push beyond their limits to save strangers, and how neighbors come together in times of crisis. But Jesus was not just talking about emergencies. He meant every single day. The solution to the fires begins with people choosing to see and care for one another, not as competitors or strangers, but as family. Jake remembered how the voice had spoken about hope as though it were a fire of its own, a fire that could spread, consuming despair and igniting strength. Hope, Jesus said, was not just wishful thinking. It was a choice. It was waking up every day and deciding to believe that things could get better, that the effort to create change was worth it, even if the results were not immediate. Jake thought about how easy it had been to lose hope over the years. He had seen homes destroyed, lives lost, and people broken by circumstances beyond their control. But the voice reminded him that hope was not about what had already happened. It was about what could still be. Jake also remembers that Jesus told him to forget about worldly things. This part of the message had been the hardest for Jake to understand at first, but as he reflected, it became clearer. The voice wasn't saying that people should abandon their lives or possessions. Instead, it was a call to stop placing so much value on temporary things. People were consumed by materialism, by the need to have more, own more, and control more. And in the pursuit of those things, they had lost sight of what truly mattered, which is relationships, kindness, love, and the well-being of others. Jake remembered Jesus' voice urging humanity to shift their focus, to let go of the distractions that divided them, and to prioritize the things that brought them closer together. When Jake woke up in the hospital, the weight of that message was overwhelming. He could not just go back to life as usual. This was not something he could keep to himself. He felt a responsibility, a pull as strong as the one that had brought him back to Earth, to share what he had experienced. At first, Jake was not sure how to start. Who would believe him? A firefighter claiming to have spoken to Jesus while nearly dying in a fire? It sounded absurd, even to him. But the memory of that voice would not let him rest. He decided to start small, sharing his story with his colleagues and friends. Jake spoke about the moment he passed out, the vision of the city burning, and the overwhelming sense of peace he felt in the presence of the light. He shared the message Jesus had given him, explaining how it was not just about stopping the fires, but about healing the world. To Jake's surprise, people listened. His colleagues, hardened by years of facing life-and-death situations, were moved by his story. Many of them had their own moments of doubt and despair, and Jake's words gave them something they had not felt in a long time: hope. They began sharing his story with others, and soon it spread beyond their circle. Local communities started reaching out to Jake, asking him to speak at events and gatherings. He found himself standing in front of groups of people, not just firefighters, but families, teachers, and students, sharing the message he had received. The impact was undeniable. Jake saw people coming together in ways he had not seen before. Neighbors who barely spoke began organizing efforts to support those who had lost their homes in the fires. Churches, community centers, and even schools started hosting discussions about how to build stronger, more connected communities. People began to focus less on what divided them and more on what they could do to help one another. Jake did not stop there. He felt that the message was not meant to stay local. The fires in California are part of a larger crisis, and Jake believes that the same message can resonate with people everywhere. He started sharing his story online, using videos and posts to reach a wider audience. At first, he was hesitant. He was unsure if people would take him seriously, but the response is overwhelming. His videos are being shared thousands of times, with people from all over the world reaching out to say how much his story has inspired them. That's why we are sharing this story with you. Jake's experience is not just his own. It is a call to action for all of us. The fires may have started in California, but their lessons are universal. They remind us of the importance of helping one another, holding on to hope, and focusing on the things that truly matter. They challenge us to reflect on how we live our lives and how we can create a better, more connected world. And yet, Jake would be the first to tell you that his journey is not over. He continues to grapple with the enormity of what he experienced, and he is committed to sharing the message with as many people as he can. If you want to hear more real-life experiences like Jake's, make sure to subscribe to our channel, because stories like this have the power to change lives. And who knows, the next one might just change yours.